there, this is me, Malorian, and this is going to be a video on hills. Now, why are we talking about hills at all? Well, the reason is because with this whole Oblivion update, all the new themes, new rulebook coming out, one of the things that they said is happening is that hills are out of the game. There's no more hill as a terrain type, just like how there's obstructions and forests and stuff like that. Hills is no longer one of them. They're out of the game. So what I thought would be really good, because there's people thinking like, meh, there's people kind of upset. There's a few people who kind of like it, but it's kind of like a real spectrum of how people think of it. So I thought I really want to try and give it my own take. And this is going to be coming from three different kind of points of view. One, me as a player. Two, one is a TO and a tournament organizer, and third, just kind of like that whole like historical type of thing. You know, I'm not exactly like the biggest, hugest history buff, but social studies was one of my always favorite things. I took it in IB. I love history, but I would never go as far to say like, look, I'm a PhD in, you know, European warfare. Like, no, I'm not that type of a thing, so don't think I'm coming to this from that type of perspective. But again, I want to make sure I touch on all three of these areas for why hills should be leaving the game. So I think to really start this is to start from my player point of view and talk about how I first came into contact with hills in tabletop wargaming. And that was in, well, I guess you could kind of really say it was 40K, whereas like, a hill is just something that's there. I mean, in 40K, it's all about line of sight. So if there's something there, whether it's a building or a hill, it's just if it blocks line of sight, it blocks line of sight. So, okay, sure. You know, it's just something there to be in your way, and that's really it. But I think that really the first time where I was like, hey, hills are something that are interesting on the battlefield would be in Warhammer Fantasy. Now, if you're listening to this now as a Warhammer Fantasy person, this probably means nothing to you, but the Skaven Doom Wheel used to be something that get an advantage from being on a hill and coming down it. And to kind of give you a perspective of what this is, the Doom Wheel is like, and again, Skaven is like this race of rat creatures, so the whole idea of like a hamster running on a wheel, think of that, where it's like this big wheel with stuff running on the inside, and then there's guns and stuff on it as well. So the way it worked is that if you had a Doom Wheel starting on a hill, it could go down it and go super fast and smash into something really hard. And it's like, that's cool, right? That's the way that hills should work. It's like, well, I don't know, like if that's the idea, like you should be rolling things downhill, but it made sense. It was interesting, very flavorful. Another part of it was when you'd want to have shooting units and models on top of hills as well, because again, true line of sight, you want to shoot over things, not give them extra cover bonuses or anything like that. So you'd be putting all your cannons and archers on top of hills, and other later rules, you know, if you had them on hills, other ranks can fire and stuff like this, but it gave you a reason to put range units on top of hills because you'd get an advantage. Now, as a player, this is where I also started to hate hills, because when it came to from fantasy, you'd have these trays of like somewhere between 10 to like 100 models, and when you're on a hill and the tray does this, your models do this and they all fall off. And you just really started to dislike hills just because of how they'd make your models fall off of them. Now, you might be thinking like, Malorian, let's keep the whole 2D, 3D terrain conversation separate from hills, but I think you really can't, because as a player, the whole idea of 2D versus 3D, the most egregious piece of terrain was the hill. Buildings you move around, rivers you move over or go to bridges, you know, forests were something we can move the trees or whatever, but hills, you literally needed something that was slanted to put your models on, and if they're on the tray, they could slide down the tray. If they're a single model, well, you already have some models that are top heavy. If you do this to them, they're probably falling over. So it was just one of those things where it's like hills just made you look like, you knew something bad was likely to happen when you're dealing with a hill and you have one of your tall, heavy models or a big tray of models as well. So as a player, that's where like the, oh cool, came to like that, oh, that kind of really sucks. Now, we're talking about Warmachine, so let's bring this back to Warmachine. And I think the biggest part that it started is like hills were at first something that were interesting because you'd place them down somewhere and your models would run to them, you'd put a toe on them, you got +2 defense against shooting. So if you had a hill scattered somewhere, that's where your models were running to try and put a toe on it, so that all of a sudden then if you were being shot at, you get some extra defense. But they changed that. So from Mark II to Mark III, you had to be completely on the hill. And all of a sudden that made it a lot less enticing, because now if you want to be getting a defense bonus, first of all, fewer models could get the bonus, and secondly, you're all combined in this tiny little area, so there's any AoEs or anything like that, you're getting cranked, and it's just like, it just got less of a real bonus. I think a really big thing of it too is that you have to think about the rules that went above it are added to it apart from the +2 defense. And that was the whole rules about how you're able to see over models or be seen. And I think one of the best things is kind of compare how it went with trenches as well. So a good example here is Siege 1. His old feat would just make a trench. And for trenches, if you're completely in a trench, you don't block line of sight. And so you would cast it on an enemy unit, basically sink it down in a trench, and then shoot the thing that's hiding behind it. Pretty easy, kind of like sometimes catching your opponent off guard. But hills got a little bit weird because it really depended on the base size. So if you're on this hill, you can now see over anything that was your size or smaller. So especially in Mark II, a Colossal with their toe on a hill could see the world. But then things got more extreme or different when you got to Mark III. And so this the whole rules of like what sees what. You know, already the line of sight rules in Warhammer Fantasy, I'm getting my games mixed up, in Warmachine are kind of not super clear. And what I mean by that is that they don't make 100% logical sense. So if you have a Colossal, you have a row of dudes in base to base that are all a medium base size, and then on the other side you have a small base model. The small base model can see the Colossal because you look up, but the Colossal can't see the small base model because you don't look down. The medium models, they're in base to base, block that line of sight one way, but not the other way. So that was already kind of weird. And then when you add in the hills, we're like, okay, now I'm on a hill, so I see over these types, but not these types. And now these types can see me, but these other types can't see me. It just got overly complex. And as now I guess I'm moving more to a TO where I have people asking like, okay, if I'm on this hill, can they see me? What can I see? It really got to a thing where it didn't come up often. And even as a TO, I always found myself having to go back to the book to remember how it worked with this edition, whether it be Mark II, Mark III, and then always sometimes getting confused with old games as well. So with that part as well, I was just like, it was just kind of weird and a little bit different. Talking about a TO as well, hills got a lot less important. As I said, if you weren't completely on them, they weren't really a big effect on the battlefield. And what had a much larger effect is things actually just block line of sight. So all of a sudden you start having rules in your terrain or guidelines where you want to have about 1, 2, whatever line of sight blocking piece of terrain near the center of the board. So all of a sudden that means like where you want to have like buildings and stuff like that around the center of the board to really be effectively blocking line of sight, hills didn't do any of that. So me as a TO, when I'm starting to build terrain, I'm already putting hills more near the outside because they're not going to be meeting one of those requirements on the inside. And at the same time, when I'm putting terrain on the inside or outside, hills were just going to be the thing that did the least amount of anything. I mean, really, when I'm placing things down and there's a hill as one of the main pieces in the center of the board, let's think about quadrants, where every quadrant of the board needs to have like 2 pieces of terrain and stuff like that. If you're using that method, if any one of those pieces is a hill, it's usually just open terrain. Just models run through it, and it's like there's nothing there. I mean, really think about it. For all the different types of terrain, if there's a hill as one of your central pieces, it is more impactful if it's anything else. I usually found myself using hills when I wanted to make a worse side of the table. So when I want to make one side better for the other, so there's an advantage to go second, I would typically put a hill on one side as opposed to cover or a trench or a wall on the other side. So saying, all right, your caster can either have a 4+ cover over here, or on the other side here, 4+ cover, a +4 defense cover, or on the other side, you're having a +2 elevation. So it's really just trying to be like a worse piece of terrain. And then a lot of times then I just didn't want to do that. I just didn't want to have this piece of terrain on the board that didn't do anything. I found that if I was doing that 2 pieces of terrain on each quadrant and one of them was hill, well, now I kind of want to throw down like 9 or 10 just to kind of balance this out, because you had this kind of like nothing piece of terrain. Now, I do say a nothing piece of terrain, but we do have to realize that it did have that extra rules, right? Elevation was different than cover or concealment, and being able to see over or be seen was still a thing. So, you know, it wasn't that it didn't do anything, but they just were so much more now corner case, and because they were so corner case, they added this extra confusion to the game that at some point you have to ask a question about whether it's worth it or not. And so for Privateer Press to now come to the point and say that we're no longer going to have hills, as a player, I'm pretty much okay with that. They were already either a nuisance if we were talking about 3D terrain. From a competitive standpoint, they were playing a smaller and smaller factor. And then as a TO, for the most part, I'm like, yeah, sure, I wasn't using them anyway. And I think if anything, as a TO, the thing that might annoy me is the fact that I have all this hill terrain now that's not really doing anything. And now I have to think about, do I draw fire on it so it can be a flaming forest? Do I have to like spray it white so it's a cloud? Do I just hold on to it and maybe in Mark IV, hills will come back? But I think at the same time, you have to realize that if you are a person who are against this and want to use hills, if you're a TO and you're like, I got 50 hills, I'm not throwing them in the garbage, you're always free to keep on using them. If you want to be in your tournament, be like, yeah, we're doing a steamroller, but there's going to be hills. It gives you a +2 elevation, deal with it, and there's also going to be some line of sight and stuff. Sure, you have the power to control your own games, to control your own tournaments. Whether something is in a tournament format or not does not force you as a player or as a TO to do anything. So I think even at that point there, as someone who might be against it, there's nothing really stopping you until you're one of these things where, look, I want to run an official event that gives you points for Iron Gauntlet or something like that, and then you got to stick to the rules. If you're not in that type of scope, it really doesn't matter. Now, that's touching on it as a player and as a TO, but I think it's good to also talk about it as just that whole part of history where hills play a big part of the game when it comes to the actual real battles that occurred. You know, if we're looking back in the past where you'd want to be on a hill so that you can survey and see the entire battlefield, you wanted to take the high ground because pretty much your enemy running up the hill is literally putting them into like slow mode. And so as they're slowly coming up the hill, you can shoot them with arrows, you can react first to hit them first. It just gave you a real advantage. But at the same time, that advantage changed over history. So whereas in the beginning, where you'd want to be having that hilltop so you could be seeing where your formations were and know where to send things out before the times of, say, like radio, being able to see these things. Whereas in the later years, where you're wanting to have that high ground so that you have that advantage of being able to shoot down and be able to take the advantage where they're slowly coming up to you. The problem is that that advantage disappeared. All of a sudden, when your opponent has guns and cannons, if you're up on a hill, you're getting shot a lot more easily. You're just kind of like presenting yourself. And so all of a sudden you kind of would be in trenches, on hills, and now you can see out and you're protected from being shot. Unless now we're talking about even later, we got like rockets coming in and they're like exploding the whole hill. So they're like, yeah, go ahead, bunch up on that hill, I'm just going to explode you. And the hard thing to say is, where would this even fall in line with the whole Imran world and Warmachine? You know, we have things where sword knights, where are these idiots? You know, we got these dudes where you're literally shield and a sword, and that's what you are. And at the same time, we got frickin' robots and lightning machines, and they're shooting these things out and shooting rockets, and man, like, where do you even say this should even place? And should the rules of the hills be different for, like, okay, if you got a sword, it does this, but if it's got a rocket, then this, like, it just isn't worth it. I think it's one of those things where you have to realize and look at it, like, okay, in history, hills had a place, but there's a lot of other things that had a place in history as well. Like, whenever you're playing your games, when do you ever actually deal with bringing more reinforcements and things from the back lines? I mean, sure, you can say like things like the structure brings back more trenchers, but what about resupply of like food and water? I remember there's some old games where they actually have that. There's actually supply lines, and a big part of what you want to do with your strategy is cut off the supply lines. Like, where's that in this game? So you can't really go too far into that. You have to realize you're playing a game of robots versus dragons versus werewolves, and it's a fantasy game with swords and laser beams, and it's just the way things end is magic. At some point, it has to be whatever makes the game function. And I think we have to really admit to ourselves that whether you're coming to it as a player or as a TO, Hills just weren't really doing it. They were just making things more complicated, just adding more issues when it comes to 3D terrain. And at the end of the day, any one of the other pieces of terrain were more effective to actually making the impactful difference on the game. You know, if I have a hill, if we say the only piece of terrain in the middle of the board will be one thing, the hill will be the least impactful. Well, I guess suppose like one massive trench might be not impactful either. But you get what I'm saying, right? Where all these pieces, if it's a cloud, if it's a forest, if it's an actual trench or a wall or something that's giving you a bigger benefit, that's changing the board more than this one thing that generally just gives you open terrain to just run through and nothing else matters. And also just trying not to add a new set of rules, right? Where we have cover, concealment, and now there's elevation as well with different impacts, with different things. I just don't think it's that big of a loss. The biggest thing to me is just the fact that I have all this terrain that I got to do something else with, but at the same time, like we said, if I want to use it, I can still use it. So there you go. There's Hills. If you didn't know what was going on, now you know pretty much the whole thing. If you're a person that was for or against it, hopefully I covered the whole gambit. There is some argument saying that it did have some place, both on the gameplay and in history. Hopefully I covered the negative. I'm definitely more so against it. So if you have anything that you disagree with me, hey, please post it down below. I'm always happy to keep up the conversation, but there's almost no conversation to be had here. PP is saying it's out of the game. It's out of the game. And if you're a person who says, screw the rules, I'll still do my own thing at home, you'll still say screw the rules and do your own thing at home. So there you have it. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your Oblivion spoilers, because we should all be having lots of fun right now. All right, bye.